Welcome to Detroit Today on 1019 WDET. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm really glad you've joined us. We are here at the Detroit Public Library on Woodward Avenue for a live taping of Detroit Today, and we've gathered people here to talk about a really serious issue in the city of Detroit. That's the issue of how many children start the school year in one school and end the school year somewhere else, and maybe along the way make a couple of other stops. This is an issue that has been a big deal here in the city of Detroit for a very long time. Back in the 1990s, when I covered schools in Detroit, this was an issue. Chalkbeat Detroit and Bridge Magazine recently did their own story about how prevalent this issue is and the impact that it has on education, the impact on teachers, the impact on students, the impact on families. And we want to spend the hour today talking more deeply about all of that from a number of different perspectives. And our first panel is made up partially of the people who are responsible for the work. I want to welcome Chastity Pratt-Dawsey, who is a reporter at Bridge Magazine. Chastity, welcome to the show.
Hello, Detroit.
Also with us, she says that every time on the show. Hello, Detroit. I also want to welcome Aaron Einhorn, who is the bureau chief of Chalkbeat Detroit. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi.
And Ben Pogodziński, who is an associate professor of educational leadership and policy studies at Wayne State University. He was responsible for a lot of the data that was used in this report. Ben, welcome to Detroit today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So Aaron and Chastity, I'm going to start with the two of you. Talk about what your reporting told us. It told us a lot of things that I think people intuitively believed were true in Detroit, but it told us some things that we didn't know as well.
Yes, I think I've said it a couple times since the story ran back in October. This is something that a lot of us grew up with, those of us in our 30s, 40s. We grew up with seeing mobility, student transients. But this current generation of students, anyone who's in school now from K to 12, they've grown up with a hyper sense of transience or mobility. The idea of a neighborhood school isn't what it used to be. And we've seen this slowly over the past 15 years get worse and worse and worse and worse to a point where it's just part of the school culture. Most schools know that it happens. And when Erin moved to town a couple years ago and joined Chalkbeat, she said, what? What's going on here? And I'm like, yeah, so, and? It's like, that's not normal, right? So it took her coming from a different place and coming here and saying, you guys, this isn't normal. Maybe we should look into it. And I thought to myself, yeah, it's not normal, is it? And I mean, because we had just watched it happen over the years, and it just became part of how things go. And I didn't really think of it as a story, but it clearly was. And we also found that out when Ben and Sarah did the data crunch.
Yeah. Ben, quickly, I want to get you to talk about the data that you used and what it actually tells us, how you quantify this problem, as opposed to just sort of saying, well, it's a big deal in the city.
Right. My colleague Sarah Lenhoff and I and some colleagues at Wayne State, we have student-level data from the state, so this is administrative data. So we're allowed or able to track the individual student as they move between these schools over the years. So oftentimes as they report and we're finding the data, it's not just one move and they're staying in a school. They're making multiple moves over the years, within year, between years. And with this data, we have school level data, student level data, so we know something about the schools that they're leaving and going to and returning to, so we can understand sort of the relationship between school level factors and student level factors in this system. And really kind of what's driving this both within the city, but students are also going outside of the city to charters in suburban areas as well as other traditional school districts. But they're not always staying there. They're going there, they're coming back. So it's really creating this churn.
Go ahead, Jess.
No, I was just going to say, we all know that Detroit has its problems with poverty and income inequality and employment issues. Bottom line is, when you see one out of 3 elementary school students changing schools. That's a problem. And it's not just a problem because it's rare and it's different, but it's because almost half of those kids are moving not because mom and dad moved, but because mom and dad are looking for a better school, a different school, a better situation, a different fit. And that whole idea of we have options, let's just move, is different from our generation, right? When we didn't like the school, mama went up to the school and said, change it, fix it, not I'm gonna move.
Yeah.
And so you got 1 out of 3 elementary school kids changing schools every year, and almost half of them are not doing it because their family moved. That's a phenomenon.
It's a dynamic that we have created here through a number of different changes that have been made to the educational landscape. Erin, can you talk about what some of those changes were and how we got to this space of Uber shopping parents when it comes to school?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to note that, the research on what happens when students move this frequently is very clear. Test scores are lower, dropout rates are higher, behavioral problems are more significant. Families' relationships with the school, their willingness to be involved in the school and support the school, that all goes down. And all of the factors that educators need in order to take a school that's struggling and try to turn it around become significantly more complicated if the students that they're working with, that they're making progress with, then disappear. And then, when that, so the students who start the school year in September are not necessarily the same ones sitting down to take the state exam in the spring. And so that creates all kinds of really difficult, complicated problems, which is why we wanted to delve into this issue and look at, the consequence and what it means for schools. And then we also looked at the causes, right? So we knew that people were moving. We had the research from Ben and Sarah showing the extent to which they're moving. 1 in 3 kids, elementary school kids, every year are moving. But we wanted to know, okay, why are they moving? And one of the things that Chastity and I did is we spent part of the year with 1 8th grade class at Bethune Elementary Middle School in Northwest Detroit and talked to each of the kids in the class. The average student in that class of 8th graders had been to more than 4 schools on their path to 8th grade. One of the kids had been to 9 schools. A bunch had been to 7, a bunch had been to 6. And just think about that. All of those schools between kindergarten and 8th grade, and that's a K-8 school. So only, I think, 3 kids in the class had been there since kindergarten. So, and the reason why is because, part of it is that families are moving. So I think, Ben, your research found that 40% of the families that had moved in the 2015-16 school year had changed their zip code. So that's a lot of sort of family housing instability. But then the other 60% didn't move. They left the schools that they were in because they chose to leave. And they left because of a lot of structural things that we in this city and in this state have built. And one of those things is we've given them choices, right? So,
And there's sort of a natural tension in the city between choice and quality. We have all of the choice in the world as parents in Detroit to send our kids to all kinds of schools. You can send them anywhere, to a public school, to a charter school, to a school in your neighborhood, to a school across the city. If you can get them there, the challenge is finding a school that meets your standard of quality and meets it for more than a month or 6 weeks at the beginning of the year.
and when we did some survey data, we talked to 100 Detroit parents across the city with children with different age, and we asked them, why did you move your child? And we added up their reasons, and the number one reason was, I wasn't happy at that school. My child's needs weren't being met at that school. Examples that people gave included, there were 40 or 50 kids in that class, and my child has special needs, and her needs weren't being met. Or we heard, they had 5 principals in 3 years, or something like that. That's, or they had, there was quite a few of them actually were children with special needs who had IEPs that spelled out services that they were supposed to be receiving, and the school wasn't delivering on that. And so rather than fight, they have the legal right to those services, but you have to get a lawyer and force the school to implement them. It was easier to just find another school that might do that instead.
Ben, I wonder, how much you feel the school district is aware of the data that you collected and analyzed for this. I mean, it seems like it'd be very important for them to have it. Was it evident that they were tracking the same things?
I don't know if it is evident, but in this marketplace, they're surely aware because schools are funded largely by a per pupil foundation allowance.
And the
So
money
they
moves
know
with the kids, right?
the money moves with the kids. Over the last several years, 10, 20, 30 years, right, there's been a declining population. At the same time, there's more and more charter schools being built during that time. So there's a surplus of seats for the number of kids, and there's this fierce competition to get them for the most part. So in addition to parents, shopping around looking for what's best for their kids, there's this marketing campaign. They're constantly being told, come over here, it's better over here. So it creates this culture and this psychology of it's easier to exit. And from state policy, the explosion of charter schools and inter-district policies, open enrollment policies, it reduces those costs of exit, as you said.
I mean,
So-
you know what,
yeah.
though? The bottom line is, why are we talking about this? We're talking about this because, like Aaron said, it's not good for kids. Moving your kid from school to school to school is not good for kids. The scores show it, and I think that this discussion right now will help to inform people in Detroit and across the state. When you hear that Detroit has the very worst test scores of any school in the world, Craig, I mean, or at least in the nation, part of it is Detroit's decline, Detroit hitting rock bottom in the nation on the nation's report card happened at the same time as this uber mobile student. It's part and parcel why students are performing so badly. They don't sit still long enough.
So let's go back 20 years, 25 years, and talk about the arguments that were made in favor of this wide selection of choice that Detroiters were given. Everyone said this would make things better. This would give us more quality choices. Chastity, what happened?
Well, here in Michigan, 1993-94, you have, yes, charter school law, and allows charter schools to be opened by just about any educational entity in the state, right? The difference between our charter school law here and the quality of our charter schools here and the charter schools laws where charter schools are performing better is accountability, right? We have more of a free market charter school system here in Michigan. Me and Aaron want to open up a charter school, we can do it. I mean, it's just about that easy. But in other places where charter schools are performing better, it's very difficult. You have to have a proven track record. There's only one entity that, like in Massachusetts, there's only one entity that charter
Authorizes,
schools
right.
or authorizes, and that's the State Department of Education. I mean, simply put, here in Michigan, it's fairly easy to get a charter, and there's no standards for whether or even benchmarks for the performance that the kids have to meet. And so what has happened is 20 years have passed before we're able to say that in Detroit, charter schools are slightly better than traditional schools. And that wasn't the promise 20 years ago.
Is it fair to put all of that on charter schools? Is it fair to put all of what we're seeing now in terms of not just mobility but poor results on choice?
No, I mean, I think if you ask Detroit parents, do you want choice? Their answer is yeah. I don't want to have to be stuck at one school that I don't like. I want to have choice. And I'm a Detroit parent, right? And I looked at lots of schools and I weighed a lot of choices. I think, but the question is whether or not choice is a solution to problems we have in schools, right? Is choice, and I think one of the original arguments for having choice, and we don't just have charter schools, it's, Michigan also has schools of choice. You can leave 30,000 Detroit children leave the city every day to attend school in the suburbs.
In another district.
In other districts. And then those districts are all competing with each other for students too. And they're sending buses into Detroit to pick up Detroit kids all across the city and bringing them out of the city. So choice isn't just sort of a district school versus charter school. It's not a football game between the two factions, right? But the question is, the original argument was choice was going to make our schools better. It was going to make them more competitive. they were going to have to really up their game in order to compete for students. And what they've done is that they have upped their recruiting game to compete for students. They've had to set aside resources that used to go to instruction and put it in marketing. They've and then and now they're also spending money on the consequences of all of this movement. So choice doesn't equal quality.
If the schools were good, you wouldn't see all this. Flat out. I mean, you got 1 out of 3 kids, not 1 out of 3 Detroit public school kids.
1 out of 3
kids in the city. Only half the kids, and probably slightly less, attend the Detroit public schools. So it's 1 out of 3 elementary school students in the whole city are moving. So charter schools are seeing this churn as well. And it's because the quality is not there. Parents in Detroit want the same thing that everybody else wants, which is a good school. And the minute they find out it's not a good one, a lot of them say, I'm out of here. And that the problem is they don't understand that mobility and transience has an academic cost with it.
Yeah. You can't put the genie back in the bottle is one way to look at this, right? Choice is here. It's probably not going to go away. So how do we fix this? What are some of the things we could do that would directly sort of discourage the behavior that parents have become really used to in Detroit?
Improve the quality of the schools.
Okay.
I mean, that's
I can snap my fingers and do that, right?
Come on, Stephen. Snap your fingers.
But I mean, that's the point, right? I mean, that's very difficult. We've struggled with that for longer than 25 years in the city. We're really maintaining or increasing school quality in the public schools, and now in this new system of charter schools that has grown over the last 25 years without quality controls. How do we, if we were to wait for that to fix itself, we'd wait a long time, and this problem would persist. Are there other things that we can sort of grab hold of and pull the lever on that would at least change the landscape?
Well, one thing I think policymakers can look at, so the money follows the kid, but when the kids are moving in and out, right, it really creates a financial destabilization effect as well as this kind of social kind of community aspect within the schools. So, I mean, there's been talk about funding schools differently. So it's based on, a 3-year average of enrollment or whatever it is, so that they have some resources to try to improve over time, rather than I have to focus so much on marketing to get more kids in here, or we can't have a school.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about the way that the schools are financed could be a start, as well as thinking about how enrollment systems operate, even within the Detroit Public Schools Community District, so that there's some more coherence and clarity in where kids are even located. Because in our research as well, we're seeing large number of kids enrolled in more than one school at a time. As they're kind of shopping around, they'll register and not show up, and then they'll go to a different school. So having more kind of a coherence in the system as well.
I mean, I think there's also supports you could provide to the schools that are, so training so that when a new student arrives, the school is ready for them, that they have an onboarding system, a way of orienting that student that doesn't just fall on the teacher. So one of the interesting things in the research is that it's not just students who are moving whose test scores are lower. If you are in a class with classmates who are mobile, your scores are lower too, right? So it's affecting the whole school, not just the kids who are moving. And a lot of that is because of the destabilizing impact that has on the classroom, and the fact that a teacher who has a lesson plan has got to, all of a sudden, there's a new student in her class, and she's got to find that student a desk, she's got to find him a book, she's got to, and a lot of that falls on the teacher. And so, what are the resources we could give to our schools to better help them absorb? Is there a curriculum thing? I mean, obviously, you standardize the curriculum, it makes it easier as students move from school to school. They're not going to have to go over the same material twice, or have gaps and things like that. And there's other things that we could do to better keep track of students. We don't necessarily know when a student leaves the school doesn't necessarily know where that child went, and they don't know if the child's even safe. So, could we have a centralized record-keeping system in Detroit so that we would at least know where every child is?
So I think what Ben and Aaron are pointing to are two different issues that need solving. Number one, how do you stop the parents from moving so much? And in the short term, when you're trying to figure that out, how do you reduce the impact on students who are moving over and over again? A standardized curriculum, an orientation process might help with the kids who are continuing to move while you're trying to figure out how to stop that, right? But what you're going to hear later on, you're going to hear Ms. Woods from Bethune talk about what it looks like on a daily basis when it's November and the kid is just showing up. That's real. A kid who hasn't been to school in months, just showing up in November. And getting kids into December and January and April and May. When we were at Bethune last year, for that 8th grade class, there were 30-some kids in that class. 11 of them showed up that year, a third of the class. And I'm sure Ms. Andrews will be able to talk to you. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with that? Kids coming and going all the time. Right. You're stopping the class. You're stopping the lesson. You're helping this kid. You're trying to differentiate. But who is this kid and can they even read? Mm-hmm. These are real everyday issues that need short-term and long-term solutions. And that's how you get at it. Short-term and long-term solutions that people and experts and educators and parents have suggested.
Okay, Chastity Pratt Dossie, reporter with Bridge Magazine. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Anytime.
Aaron Einhorn, Bureau Chief of Chalkbeat Detroit. Great to see you here.
Thank you.
And Ben Pogajinski, Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at Wayne State University. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, up next, we're going to see this from the ground level. We'll talk with a parent, a teacher, and a principal about transients in Detroit Public Schools. Stay with us on Detroit Today. This is Detroit Today on 101.9 WDET. I'm Stephen Henderson. And as always, I'm glad you've joined us. We are live at the Detroit Public Library on Woodward in Midtown Detroit for a special discussion about transients in Detroit Public Schools. The number of kids who start school in one place and maybe end the school year in a different place, the impact that has on children, on learning, on classrooms, on families. We want to take a pivot now and talk about this from the ground level, the things that people see on a daily basis in Detroit schools with regard to that problem. And we've got three people who are on the ground level to help us with that discussion. Dawn Wilson-Clark is a parent and advocate for 482 Forward. Dawn, welcome to Detroit Today.
Thank you.
Catherine Andrews is a teacher at University Prep Academy. Catherine, welcome to Detroit Today.
Hello, thank you.
And Alessandra Woods is the principal at Bethune Elementary Middle School.
Hello.
Alessandra, welcome to Detroit Today. So, Dawn, I just want to start with you from a parent perspective. What's been your experience with kids moving from school to school during the school year and disrupting that consistency that's so important to learning?
Well, I have moved my children to 29 different schools.
Wow, 29. In what time frame?
I have 5 children. So from kindergarten to 12th grade.
And talk about that decision each time to say, we're in this school, and I think we've got to go somewhere else. What is it that brought you to that decision each time?
I was not happy with what was happening in the building. And when I tried to make change, it didn't happen. My children have gone to charter schools, public schools, private schools. They're all in the district now. But at some of the charter schools, I did not have the accountability. There were mismanagement of funds, and when I would question the board and the treasurer about it, I was told, don't worry about that. At one school. Another school, they changed management companies in the middle of the year, did not notify the parents, fired teachers, fired principals, and I just want the best for my children.
Do you see the issues that crop up for you in charter schools is more profound than the ones in public school? I mean, are you going back and forth between the systems, or did the charter schools just sour you on it altogether?
They did.
They did. So, and that's why you're back in the district. But do you continue to move around within schools in the
No,
district?
I am content
Uh-huh.
where I am.
Uh-huh. So talk about that contentment. What was it that brought you to a place where you said, okay, this is good enough?
My children, they saw the difference, and they're pleased.
And how long of a time frame did it take you to reach that point?
Well, this is actually the second year,
Uh-huh.
so.
Yeah. Okay. Catherine Andrews, you work in the charter arena.
Yes.
Talk about what this looks like from that end.
So from the charter arena, when at my district at UPA, when students move in the middle of a year, it really has an impact on the class. It's kind of seen as like, it's almost like the class is going through like a mourning period, like they're going through grief, because they're looking at it like, you know, it's a plate missing from the dinner table. Where is Shine? Why is Shine not here? Why did we not get a chance to say goodbye? And then on the receiving end, if I receive a student like maybe a month into school, it is rough because I have to get them acclimated. If they're not familiar with the UPA district, I have to not only acclimate them to the rigors of our curriculum, I have to acclimate them to the culture of our school. A lot of times it's kind of like getting them reintroduced to what school actually looks like, that this is a nurturing, caring, safe environment.
Do you feel like the kids who you're getting throughout the year are often behind the work that you're doing, or is it just an acclimation question? I mean, is it just getting used to the new environment?
No, majority of the time when I get children in the middle of the year, we'll usually get somebody maybe in the end of September, beginning of October, and then again, you know, right after Christmas break. And I'll see, you know, the students' records, and it'll say, hey, you know, Sharice got an A in reading from this school, or a B in science, and then I get them, and it's like, Sharice isn't even reading on grade level, or nowhere near grade level. And it's like, well, what was going on at the schools before? So I get them from both public schools as well as charter schools. So it's rough.
And talk about the differentiation then that you have to introduce into teaching because of that. How do you manage that?
So it's like I'm a centipede, literally. So I'm differentiating my normal lesson for my high, medium, low students for my regular class. But then it's like, okay, I got to pull my kids from my high, medium, low. I also have to accommodate students that have IEP needs. Then I still have to pull a student or two who is new, so I can do some one-on-one with them to catch them up on what we've already been covering in the unit.
Wow.
So it's a lot. It's a lot of multitasking that's going on in a 55-minute class period.
Sure. Yeah. Elisenda Woods, you're the principal at Bethune Elementary Middle, which is one of the schools that's featured in the Chalkbeat and Bridge reporting. Some really intense, pretty harrowing stories in there about what goes on in your school. Give us a sense, though, of how this issue affects your work
Sure.
as the leader in that building.
So Aaron mentioned earlier that, you know, students are arriving pretty much every month of the school year. So on yesterday, we enrolled 6 students. One parent said that.
In November.
Yes.
It's November.
Yes, November, yesterday.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
And she said that her child hadn't been to school all year, the previous year, because they were going through different things. And so, you know, right away when my enrollment clerk gets ready to enroll, she'll give me a page, come to the main office. So when I get to the main office, I sit down with mom, you know, always welcoming her to Bethune and just asking what are her needs, how can I help? And we have a lot of services in the building, so that particular parent, I called DHS and Children's Center in and the counselors, just to make sure that we service the whole child, but then also to the parent. Last year alone, we had students that had been to 8 or 9 schools, and so we see that quite often. It really is, it's like a norm, and I know that doesn't sound good, but it's a norm. But we work with the parents because our goal is to keep our children in the building. And I told Mom, I said, we want to help you find housing. So she was in a shelter. And so after 90 days, so before the 90 days is up, we want to help her to find shelter so that she can stay in the area. And I said, Mom, I really want your children to complete the school year. And you know, she was very thankful. And people are looking for hope. People are, they're hopeful. When they go to a new school, they're looking for something new. They're hopeful. Maybe their child was kicked out of another school. And so now they've arrived and they're hopeful that things will look different. And that's what people are looking for.
When you get kids in November, in December, in February, what is it that is bringing them to you? Why are they choosing you, and why are they choosing so late?
Well, quite often, children are in trouble at other schools. And honestly, they've been kicked out most of the time. Discipline problems. And again, parents are hopeful. Maybe if I take them here, they'll blend in better. And maybe I may not get as many calls. And so, you know, we may be the closest school, or maybe somebody told the parent about us, you know, my kid made it through Bethune, you know. And so people tell us that quite often, you know, you had my cousin 2 years ago, and he was awful. I'm like, oh, okay.
He was a bad kid, he made it, right?
Yeah, you know.
I think that's like the biggest form of flattery for us to receive a parent or a family within our school or within our district, and to say, hey, you know,
Right.
my neighbor went there, or my cousin went there, and they, you know, said this is great. I want the same experience for my children.
That's
I mean,
right.
that like warms our
That's
heart.
right.
I know for me it does.
Absolutely.
I'm sure
Absolutely.
it does for you as well.
Can you talk about the way you allocate resources in your building to accommodate this issue, and what you might be able to do if you didn't have to allocate resources that way? In other words, what kind of things could you have going on in your school if this weren't an issue?
Well, the good thing is, especially with our curriculum, we started out with more. You know, we expected more children to come. So right at the very beginning, you know, we expect that. So we make sure that we have enough resources at the very beginning of the year. So really everything that we're using in our building in terms of resources, we make sure that there's more than enough because we expect it. We know that more children are coming. So when we're doing our allocations, it's always for more at the very beginning, because you have to plan ahead.
Because you got to plan
You have to.
for what's going to happen.
Absolutely.
Catherine, on the last panel, we heard people talk about charter schools as driving this issue and the lack of quality and quality control in the charter sector as a primary reason that that families do that. I wonder how that falls on your ears as somebody who works in the charter system.
So I'm going to speak very frankly. I've taught at numerous schools within the city of Detroit over the past 14 years, approximately 4. There are bad charter schools. There are. They do exist. However, there are also great charter schools that exist. And it's the same thing with, you know, a private school or a public school. You have to find what matches you as well as your child. Talk to your child about how they feel going to class every day. Ask them specifics about what they're learning in each of the subjects. Ask them about how conflict is handled within the school. Does the school talk to them like they're an individual, or does the school make them feel like they're a student? Those are the types of conversations you want to have with your child so that you can make the best choice.
And really it's about the qualified teacher that they're in front of. It's not the brick and mortar, it's not the public or the charter, those are just buildings. Who's in front of these young people? You need to bring on highly qualified teachers that can do the work. Those are just entities. It's who's in front of them.
And to piggyback on what you said, not just highly qualified teachers, teachers that are actually experienced in the urban
Yes,
population,
absolutely.
or have some type of, they're a stakeholder in the
Right.
community. When teachers are stakeholders in the actual community that they serve, they are guaranteed to give 110% every single day. A teacher that's maybe not from here, or goes to, I'm not gonna say goes to the suburbs and doesn't care, but rides off to the suburbs and it's forgotten. I don't need to see the city of Detroit anymore. They're not a genuine stakeholder. You have to find those teachers that genuinely care about the progress of the city.
Dawn Wilson-Clark, I want you to talk just a little about, you were explaining earlier about taking your kids from public schools and putting them into charters. How did you decide which charter schools were the right ones for your kids? What were some of the things that you were looking for that said, this is the place that my child will get the better education?
So the number one thing for me was safety. And then, so all of the girls, I have three daughters, and they all went to different charter schools at one time because I wanted each of them to soar in their own lanes. They were compared to each other when they were all together. And so I looked at the offerings of the charters, at each of the charter schools, and that's what made me choose. But
When you
then
say, yeah, go ahead.
they took back those promises. Promises were not kept. And when, like I said earlier, when I would question what was going on, we had 5 principals in 3 years at one school. My daughters had amazing teachers, but it was the system that did not work for us.
When you say safety, can you talk a little more about what concerned you safety-wise at
So one
public
charter
school?
school my daughter went to, they had 20 fights from September to January.
Wow.
And that was not far from here. And I live in Brightmoor, and I had to take her back.
And when that would happen, would you choose you were choosing other charter schools sometimes
At
as
that,
another
when I
alternative?
did that, I chose a small private school
And now
for the
you're-
rest of the year, and then she went to another charter school.
No, I'm also curious. You say you live in Brightmoor. You have 5 children
Yes.
of different ages. What does your morning commute look like? And how do
Well,
you
it's
even
gotten
do
a
it?
lot better.
Has it?
Yes, because they're all around here.
You're sending them all
Yep.
across the city.
So one is at Cass, one's at DCA,
Okay.
DSA, and another one.
Oh, so now they're
all
right here in the
central. Yep.
Midtown area.
Yep.
But when you were sending them to other schools, were you crisscrossing the city in the morning and the afternoon?
Yes.
How did you do that in Detroit?
I have a car.
You have a
thank God.
car, right? But the distance is pretty daunting.
Yes, it was. But I would do whatever I could to make sure that they got what they needed.
Alessandra Woods, I wonder if you can talk a little about the community that your school is in and how you think the challenges in that community relate to this particular issue of mobility, of excessive mobility for
Sure.
kids.
We're on the west side of Detroit, and there are lots of challenges in that area. Definitely a transient population. People come and go due to financial challenges. Again, sometimes behavior challenges. I need to move. I need to get my kids on another side of town, and maybe this will look different. And so definitely a lot of challenges. However, we spend a lot of time working with the families, working with our children, building strong communities, strong climate and culture, so that children adjust well, and we have a great school year. And so again, it is a transient area. But again, we're always encouraging our parents to stay. And I would like to think that people try to stay so their child can finish out the year at the school. Yeah, once you build those relationships, people don't want to leave
They don't want to disrupt.
if they don't have to. sometimes you have to leave due to different things.
And I think like I think once those relationships are built, it's a
Yes.
little bit more difficult to leave a school. When a child actually enjoys
Yes.
going to school
That's it.
every day and has to miss an hour or two of school
Right.
for a doctor's appointment and, you know, expresses this like,
Right.
this upset with their parent, I think that's when it's like, bingo, this is the place for
This
me.
is
This
what I
is where I
should
need to
do.
stay and I need to do what I need to do to stay in this school district.
Okay, Dawn Wilson Clark, parent and advocate with 482 Forward. Thanks for being here on Detroit Today.
Thanks for having me, and I would like to invite everyone here and everyone listening to our fall conference this Saturday. It's called Examining the Exams. You know, we have a system that is grading our schools now, and we want to learn all about
Help
that.
parents understand how that's all
Yes.
going to work.
So that's
Yeah.
this Saturday at Mary Grove from 9:30 to 2. Hopefully, all of you can make it.
And Catherine Andrews, teacher at University Prep. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I encourage everyone to look into university prep schools.
And Alessandra Woods, principal at Bethune Elementary Middle. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, DPSCD.
Okay, up next, we're going to look at this problem from a leadership perspective. Dr. Nikolai Vitti, who is the superintendent of Detroit Public Schools Community District, is going to be here to talk about how the schools are dealing with transients. Stay with us on Detroit Today. This is Detroit Today on 1019 WDET. I'm Stephen Henderson, and as always, thanks for joining us. We are live at the Detroit Public Library on Woodward Avenue in Midtown for a special event during which we are discussing transients in the Detroit schools, the number of kids who start school in one place and may end the school year in another place and maybe stop several other places along the way. We're talking about the impact that has on kids, on teachers, on families, and on the school district more generally. We want to talk now about the sort of 1,000-foot view of this with several leaders in our community. Joining us now is Dr. Nikolai Vitti. He is the superintendent of the Detroit Public Schools Community District. Dr. Vitti, welcome to Detroit Today.
Thank you.
Also with us is Dr. Darian Driver. She is the president and CEO of United Way for Southeastern Michigan. She is a former superintendent of the Milwaukee Public Schools, and she began her teaching career right here in Detroit. Dr. Driver, welcome to Detroit Today.
Thank you.
And also with us is Maria Montoya. She is a student enrollment and engagement specialist who works with charter schools. Maria Montoya, welcome to Detroit Today. So, Dr. Vitti, I want to start with you. How big a priority would you say this issue is in Detroit schools, and specifically in Detroit public schools?
I think it's a reality that obviously we heard earlier that mainly teachers, principals, and even other students are dealing with constantly. I think when we talk about priority, it's more of a policy priority, because I think the solutions here are embedded in policy as far as what Lansing can do differently on a couple different fronts. One, and actually I think one step in the right direction is the creation of a new accountability system where we can see apples to apples how traditional public schools are doing and charters are doing in Detroit, so parents can at least get some information that is, again, apples to apples as far as standardized test scores, parent surveys, graduation rate, college enrollment, or students taking college and career-ready courses and how they're doing them. Those are just some factors to equalize the conversation, which I think is going to be important to inform parents when they make decisions that the grass is not always greener on the other side because they see a glossy pamphlet.
Are there sort of quickly accessible levers that you feel like can be pulled to really push this in a different direction, or is this a long-term problem?
I agree. It's a short and a long-term situation. So on the education front, even looking at how schools are funded, I think is an opportunity to try to reduce the amount of movement. From the FTE period in October to to where we are now, we've seen a 700 student increase in DPSCD schools alone.
Wow.
So that's 700 students that have moved into our system. So the way the funding structure works is there's 2 FTE counts. There's one in October and then one in the spring. But most of the funding is linked to the first count. So if we maybe equalize the funding where it's 50% in the first count, 50% in the second count, there's less of an incentive to move students out of schools during the first count to the second count. I think that is something structurally from a policy perspective that could help. And then obviously we've talked about this, is just better regulation of charter schools in general. With all that said, I think that there's a quality conversation and an ownership that we have in DPSCD. We've done things like standardized curriculum at the K level. We'll do that at the high school level. That'll help. Last point, outside of K-12, is this is also a socioeconomic issue. So if we want our parents moving less, there are school factors that can be addressed, but simple things like ensuring that that families have a consistent, well-paid job with benefits leads them to live in one home in one area, some level of account for affordable housing, addressing heat, water bills are all factors that lead to parents to move from one side of town to the other because of survival issues, which then impact the school system and enrollment.
Yeah, 40% of the problem is tied to displacement,
That's right.
housing
Right.
displacement. Dr. Driver, does that suggest that this is beyond a school question? I mean, we have a habit, I think, of taking problems and saying, well, let's fix them in the schools or make the schools fix them. Is this a bigger problem in the culture outside of schools than it is a problem for schools to fix inside?
I definitely believe that it's a larger problem. And so having lived and worked in Detroit, Milwaukee, and Philadelphia in the schools at different levels and seeing what can happen when you have a number of the socioeconomic issues that Dr. Vitti was referring to, the schools become microcosms and they're reflections of what's happening. And if you don't have city, county, state systems working in some kind of in tandem or concert or coordinated effort, you end up with this type of displacement. You end up with people not having some of the most basic needs being met and the stability that's needed to be able to send your child to school on a regular basis and have a consistent place where they can call home after school is out.
Yeah.
That's really what brought me to the United Way, is just seeing, coming from Milwaukee, which is a city that has one of the highest eviction rates in the country for African American females. And so seeing that transience across systems. And the other thing I just want to add is that this is so much bigger than a public school, charter school, choice school issue. It is affecting all of our schools, and it would behoove us to figure out how we can all put our resources together to try to address the issue.
Yeah. Maria, when you're working with charter schools on enrollment and engagement, how does this issue come up, or does it?
Comes up constantly.
All the time, right?
Every day, and I think absolutely agree that, I mean, there's policy issues that we need to address, and that's the conversation in charters, but then the outside factors as well. But I think there's an agreement amongst charters, no matter what type of charter it is, whether it's a single site charter or it's a charter that's operating several schools across the city of Detroit. There's also an agreement about resources, and so families not having the information they need is a big part of this problem. So in addition to working for schools and being in education, there's me, the parent, and coming here, and calling 26 schools and having 26 schools tell you, no, we're not taking your kid, we're full. And I work in education, and I could say back to them, well, you're legally not allowed to say that to me.
Tell me I
and
can't.
So, and so when I talk about information, a parent knowing, and having the ability to say that back to a school and feeling like I have the right to do that, and whether it's a charter school or it's a traditional school. So I think repeatedly we've also said here tonight, charter school, public school. Charter schools are public schools, and they're obligated to serve children. And so we need to make sure that parents also know that. So I think that, like the parent said, there are a handful of charter schools who are not acting properly. Being a parent here in Detroit, there are traditional schools that are not operating correctly. So it's about resources, it's about knowledge. I think absolutely agree, like some policy. So, I'm the former director of enrollment in New Orleans. You couldn't just move in the middle of the year and disappear. I would have people come looking for you. People would land on your doorstep and be like, you know, what's happening of the school? They would land on the doorstep of the school and say, where's the child? Why is nobody coming to look for the child? You know, we haven't seen the child in forever. That's something here, you know, talk to reporters about it for years.
It's a very long time ago that we were doing that kind of thing in Detroit.
And you continue to hear, well, it's always been that way. That doesn't make it right. A child shouldn't just disappear and nobody's not accountable for them, whether it is a traditional school or it is a charter. You know, everybody needs to be accountable for every child knowing where they've gone to.
I'm sure you heard, as I did, people on the previous panels talk about the role that charter schools are playing in this issue. A lot of blame being put on charter schools and the sort of unregulated nature of them. I wonder what that looks like from your chair.
I think it was interesting to hear because, you know, I could certainly say so in my current role. I think why we didn't give me a general title is that I do work for Grand Valley State, which authorizes the most charter schools here in Detroit. But I'm also the person that's called more often than not when a school closes. So I wear multiple hats. And I can tell you from Grand Valley's perspective, I love Aaron and I love Chastity, but they would never get a charter school out of Grand Valley. There is accountability and there is a review of those applications and there's a serious consideration, do we need this school? What DPS-CD school is right there? Are they like considering the neighborhood and the need? Is the facilities right? Is the timing right? In the past, has that happened where schools just popped up? Absolutely, but I can tell you that authorizers and the way that authorizing looked 20 years ago, you know, from my perspective, I wouldn't want to be a part of it the way it was 20 years ago. But the way authorizing is happening now, I think there's a lot more clarity around like what is needed and what contracts should actually look like, and that's accountability.
Is there still real distinction among authorizers? I know that was an issue for a long time. Grand Valley, for instance, is a really different actor than, well, we won't pull anybody up on the carpet here, but is there still that range of quality among authorizers?
I think absolutely, just like there's a range amongst traditional districts. So in my other role of working on school closure, there are traditional school districts that are really bad operators who are doing some really cheeky things when a school closes in Detroit, and you know, that's not good for DPS-CD, that's not good for Detroit charters. And there are also, you know, authorizers who I say, you know, we're leaning more towards less of this, but who think that their obligation is to create the contract, oversee the contract, and, you know, kind of get the standards and the accountability into place and oversee the board, but not be on the ground. And I think there's less of those folks now than you saw in the past. There's more people actually operating here and providing support like you would see a traditional district do. And our staff is Grand Rapids based, but any given day in Detroit, there are 70 people in schools saying, okay, what can we do as the authorizer? That didn't happen 10 years ago.
Dr. Vitti, you have said several times that your goal is not to shut the charters down through policy changes or other means. You want to create schools that keep kids and attract kids and compete with the charter schools. And yet, we've had a lot of discussion tonight about the effect of charters and competition on this problem. Can you balance those things? Do you think that if, for instance, you can create great neighborhood schools in enough places, that the policy changes may not matter as much?
That's a great question. You know, one, the emphasis that I made when I applied for the position and when I started around competition was to inject energy and a sense of urgency in a school district that had not been position-led to compete. And so when the board was looking for a superintendent, I felt I matched the description of what they were looking for, and part of that was to be unapologetic about the fact that if done the right way, traditional public schools are a better option than charters. And don't be unapologetic about that, or don't be apologetic about that. Because, and you have to look at the history of DPS to know where I'm coming from when I say that. DPS was run by emergency managers who were not educators, had no track record of raising student achievement, no record of raising enrollment rates, no record of anything education-based. So the system was run as if it was going into bankruptcy and releasing assets, not actively competing. And for lots of Detroiters, that felt like you were having to compete, but with two hands behind your back. So you weren't really competing in a policy structure that actively favored charter schools, meaning Lansing. So when the board finally gained control with an election, it was time to say, we're back. And now we're saying not only are we back, but we're on the rise. And we're not ashamed to say we're going to compete, because ultimately, if we compete, DPS-CD, that means we're providing a better level of education for children, and that's what they deserve. But at the same time, I believe we're at a point in working in partnership with charter schools to create an accountability system to say, it's not my good commercial, it's not my glossy pamphlet, it's not saying the right things that's going to speak to you to go on the other side. Now, let's look at data. Let's look at kids performing at grade level in reading, in math. Let's look at who's graduating and who not. Who's taking college-ready courses or not. Who's lowering absenteeism rates. And I'm gonna say, collectively, we're gonna start doing that. And then let that product speak to families and parents, and then let them decide. I believe right now in Detroit, there are good charter schools. And I think those charter schools are gonna survive. I think that there are more better traditional public schools, but we also have struggling traditional public schools. And I can admit that and be transparent about that, but over time we're going to improve those, or there's going to be consequences for those schools. But that we're now actively competing, and sometimes that means it makes people uncomfortable, but that's the reality. Why wouldn't a superintendent say that? Why wouldn't I be passionate about that? If I'm not, I shouldn't be superintendent. And that's where we're at. Now, will that fuel division? Hopefully not, because that there are things that we can work together on. We're doing a bus loop together. We're creating this accountability system together. So those are steps in being collaborative, as Dr. Driver talked about things that happen in Milwaukee. But competition is competition. And that's how the system is structured. That's how legislation created this situation. So let's compete.
You might as well win if you're going to compete, right? Can you fix this problem, though, or can you create this public school in a neighborhood that people knocking down the doors to get
Right.
in without fixing this problem? In other words, if you've
Right.
got 1 in 3 kids shifting schools during the year, aren't you already starting with a huge handicap?
So going back to the conference, that's a reality that we face. So at my level, there's nothing immediately that I can change at scale to solve that problem. I think when we think about collaboration with the city, we think about collaboration with the business community, is how do we stabilize socioeconomic factors that get in the way of creating a more stable school system and city. So are we really serious about employment skills? Are we really serious about not only developing stadiums and downtown and midtown, or are we serious about creating homes and neighborhoods that people can afford in and aren't moved out? That's when we get serious about equity and equal opportunity, and that's when we get serious about all Detroiters benefiting from economic revitalization. We're having those conversations, but are we serious about investing in that? When we do that, that's going to have a positive impact on traditional public schools and charter schools, but that's what it means to be serious about equal opportunity and stabilizing the socioeconomic factors that get in the way of transiency.
Go ahead, Dr. Wright.
Sure. I was just going to say, I think in your question, you know, the first thing we have to remember is that there's no way that the school district can do it by itself. And this is why you have to have strategic partnerships. You know, I believe in purpose-built communities and promised neighborhoods and things of that nature, because it's not only the schools are your anchors, because that's your anchor institution, and it always will be, and you have to have strong traditional public schools in your neighborhoods to be able to create that. But then you want to make sure you also have businesses, you have educational programs for adults, that you have food security programs, and housing and things like that can help bring some level of stability. I think the other condition that everyone would have to start to agree on is that these are all our kids. When I was superintendent, on paper, we may have had 76,000 students. By the end of the year, I was serving 82,000 kids. So it didn't matter whether, again, what sector that the kids were coming from. They're all our children. And overall, if you looked at literacy rates, transiency rates, absenteeism rates, I believe one of the speakers said earlier, this is an issue that affects all Detroit children. And so it behooves us to start looking at this as a collective issue and being much more intentional. And so things like community schools, some people might think, oh, that's fluff and that's just a nice little pie in the sky. But you can serve, again, as a superintendent, United Way had 4 community schools. We had another 6 agencies that provided those services to another handful of schools. And it's all around the wraparound services that families need. I think the other piece is, let's put programs in that attract people. So, Dr. Vidi's brought art back and music back into these programs. STEM schools, Montessori, language immersion. Those were strategies that were used during, the desegregation period. But it's time to start thinking about that, of what's going to really make sure that our children are global learners and ready for the world, and also give their family some light in their neighborhoods. And I think there's definitely a way to do it, but it has to be intentional. And we're kidding ourselves if we think that Dr. Vidi or Maria could do it by themselves. I mean, it really is going to take all hands on deck, and that's where organizations like mine have to play a role and step up to be willing to help all of our schools.
Maria, you talked a little about how different New Orleans is, and the experience there that you had was from here. I wonder, though, if you can expand a little on solutions, things that we could be doing differently in Detroit that would just lower the impact of this on kids and on families.
And I think I was going to go right there because I think it speaks to what Dr. Vitti was saying about competition. So you had competition, you had an open marketplace in New Orleans for a while. I think there's a lot of revisionist history that says that, like, boom, Katrina hit and every charter school in America opened up in New Orleans. Right. But that's not really what happened. We had an open marketplace. We had, I would not say the same level of chaos that I've seen here in Michigan. I think, a lot of you who know me, the first time I came here, I ran back home because I was like, this is a little bit crazy. This is a little bit too rodeo. Right? But it didn't work. And so I think, you can have collaboration, and we had lots of partners in the marketplace, but then we needed process and policy. We really needed to say, like, how are we going to communicate together, the traditional district and charters, and put some policies in place around transfers? How are we going to work on the funding, the per pupil funding, to make sure that every school is getting the funding, that it's following the kids, that that amount of funding is the right funding for that child? And it was uncomfortable. It was very uncomfortable. And there was a lot of, folks who said, oh, it'll never happen. But a lot of processes and policies were put in place that made it so a child can't just disappear. And, and that's huge. And also, I read in the paper today, for one of the school closure kids, mom says that she was turned away by several schools and made it so parents couldn't just be turned away by a school. And that, I called that parent today. She was turned away by charters. She was turned away by traditional schools. And so do we need a common enrollment system? Quite frankly, I founded the common enrollment system in New Orleans. I don't think that that's the answer here, but I do think we need some common policies so that Dr. Vitti's enrollment person, our enrollment contacts, we know when children are moving from place to place, and we have some kind of idea of, when are we going to get their records? How fast will that happen? Or we have some way to flag an authorizer. This child's IEP hasn't been updated in a year. So I think, of course we need partnerships. I am excited about the competition part of this because, not because it's like, ooh, charter versus traditional, because I think that's where we get to Chastity's point about we need quality schools. We need really high quality schools. We need policies and processes that make sense for families. I've been in this for 10 plus years, came into it as a parent. I'm not an educator. Came into it because I couldn't have access to a school in New Orleans and had to create a system so that my child could get access. And so we need that here too, because, we need to push the quality, but even if we get higher quality, a child could still be pushed out. Some of our highest quality schools in this city, I've walked in with parents and seen them counseled out. That's not right. That's not right. If it's a public school, a parent has the right to attend. And so when I talk about, policies or process, it's not just creating an enrollment system or a citywide hearing office where we all know who's suspended or expelled, a place where we all know when a child's getting identified with special needs. It's saying, here's a place, maybe it's run by the city of Detroit, where you can find out which schools are even open. Or, hey, I've been turned away from a school, I've been turned away from 7 schools. Everybody's saying because my child has an IEP, they don't need to take me. And that place is there as an information source for families, a hotline, you know, so I give kudos to DPSCD, you know, that's gone back and forth over the years. With emergency managers, the hotline would be up for one day, and then it would be gone.
And then it's
And you'd be
gone.
like, okay, what's happening? But now you actually have a hotline that even I can call when I'm trying to help a family to be like, hey, we need some help. But how do we also offer that help year-round for families that tells you all the information? That isn't just the information on the district, but it's also the alternative information. What if a charter or a traditional district school isn't the right thing for my child? What if I need a center-based program? Most parents don't even know what that is until they're told that's your only option. You can't go here and you can't go there, but you need to go to this place that I just made up the name of. Parents are like, well, what is that? And so when I talked earlier about information, I think there's, you know, there are these systems. And it did make it a lot easier not to lose kids. But that's uncomfortable, and I think we need to also let Dr. Vitti do what he needs to do in the district. I think there was a big push that when he got here to be like, let's do all the things together. Everybody needs to take a look at their house and say, what can I do? And I think what I mean by I'm excited about the competition is with the competition, you have people now checking their house, being like, what are we doing? You know, Dr.
Does
Vitti's
this
coming
work?
he's coming after the kids. We're losing kids. Are we gonna lose them all? And so maybe, you know, make them check themselves. And so I'm very excited about it. And I think that's something that GVSU would be very comfortable with me saying. Because also charters, the foundations of charters was to offer something different. It was that you have your community
Originally,
school.
at least, right?
Yeah, originally. And so it's also helping and impacting like how we look at applications. You know, I don't think that authorizers, when they were picking up applications even 2 years ago, were considering what is DPSCD doing in Detroit? Is there a new school coming up there? Was this gonna hurt them or help them? What does that look like? And now we do. And we also have folks saying, do we really just need another school that says they're gonna focus on math? Because these 3 said they were gonna focus on math, and that didn't
So
happen.
not really doing
And
it.
so I think that competition is also gonna bring something new to families.
Kind of a check on,
It's a real
on
check.
everybody's promises and aspirations, right?
But as a parent, I mean, I think we absolutely need information. I think the school guide was the first step in that. I don't think that half the people who needed the school guide, which was the first, you know, set of information that listed every single school, you know, can we do the school guide when we get the report card? Parents need all that information. But I want to consistently, every time I've talked to parents about the report card, say the report card just isn't enough when you don't have systems. So some of the schools, when we have the accountability system in place, they're going to come out looking great. But those schools may push out all the kids that they don't want.
That they don't want, sure.
So of course I look great on paper. So that doesn't necessarily give parents the full truth. So we need to, as leaders, make sure that we're giving parents the full information. Those facts and those numbers don't always tell the whole story.
Okay. Dr. Nikolai Vitti, Superintendent of the Detroit Public Schools Community District, thanks for being with us.
That's good.
Dr. Darren Driver, President and CEO of United Way for Southeastern Michigan, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And Maria Montoya, Student Enrollment and Engagement Specialist, works with charter schools. Thank you for being here.